Hi, and welcome to the fourth of our Bible study series on the first epistle of Peter. This week we're looking at the small but punchy section in chapter 2, verses 4 to 10. This small reading is the climax of the first section of the letter, which is everything that we've read up until here. Now in this section, Peter is really driving home their identity in the risen Christ. The big idea is that we are with Christ and therefore a part of his household, the people of God. And so in this section, as we'll see, there's a message of comfort in that news, but also an encouragement to demonstrate and to share the transformation that the gospel brings with our neighbours. Now, this passage is also packed with references and allusions to the Old Testament. But the main reference, which we'll focus on, is that it keeps on making use of the metaphor of the living stone or the cornerstone. And Peter starts off right there, where we begin in verses 4 and 5. Now, the simple word stone was deeply laden with meaning for anyone who read the Hebrew scriptures in Jesus and in Peter's day. Now, most of this came through the three passages he directly quotes, which is from Psalm 118, Isaiah 8, and Isaiah 28. But all of these images of the stone, the cornerstone, were all identified with the coming of the Messiah. Now, identifying Jesus as this cornerstone isn't new for these Christians. Jesus himself said it of himself, that he was the cornerstone. So we've got to ask, why is Peter doing that here and now? And we get an answer from verse 5. We are living stones too, just as Jesus is the living stone. So we are to become part of the living household of God, the living temple of which Christ is the chief cornerstone. Now, as such, we are now priests in this temple, offering, as it says, spiritual sacrifice. Now, this is much like Paul's language of Romans 12, verse 1, but it also takes into account everything that's come before in this letter about holy conduct. So our spiritual sacrifice is to live our lives as ones transformed by the gospel and sanctified, that is made holy by the Holy Spirit. So Peter then lays down in verses 6 to 8 his three Old Testament references, the three chapters that I mentioned before. Now these three verses, they illustrate just how Jesus is indeed the cornerstone, because they demonstrate how the world has rejected Jesus. Now this is a bit weird, but it's an incredibly important message for Peter's readers who are facing persecution. They were being rejected just as Christ had been. But this wasn't because God rejected them. And that's Peter's point. If you read in verse 7, to us who believe, Jesus is precious. Now, others might stumble over the message of Jesus. They reject him, and in doing so, they reject his people. But God has chosen us. And this is getting now into verse 9 and 10. We're called as a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, and God's own people. Now, these are all descriptors that were used of Israel as the nation had just come out of slavery in Egypt. For them, and just as much for us, this role was all about God's purpose, God's mission to redeem and to restore the whole world. So to finish this week's study, I'm going to say just a little bit about the priesthood of all believers. Now, the priest in Israel's society had two main functions. Firstly, they were to bring the word of the Lord, the Torah, to the people, to Israel. But the second was that they were to present the people of God back to God as pure and undefiled through sacrifice. So God chose Israel to be a royal priesthood, to perform this same function, but on a grand scale throughout the whole world. So they were to demonstrate the word of the Lord in word and in deed to their neighbouring nations in order that they too may become God's people. And it's the same function for us now. We share the word, the gospel of Jesus Christ, with our neighbours, just as verse 9 says. And we do that in order that they too may receive the good news with joy and believe. Right now, I think this is so important. With no physical church, we are all called as the priesthood of believers to minister to our neighbours. And I think another reason that this is so important right now is that with all the people around us facing isolation and a sense of rejection, the good news is that Jesus has shown us mercy and invites us all into God's family. Thanks again for tuning in, and I pray that these have been really fruitful for your growth in these times. Bye.